Hi, dear listeners. This is Kate Riga. I'm here to make a quick pitch that you consider becoming a TPM Prime member. TPM has used the member model for over a decade now, and our loyal members are the only reason we've been able to weather the turbulence of the media landscape and avoid the fate that has befallen so many other independent outlets. For $70, you get no paywall, fewer ads, access to the Hive member forum, a members only newsletter, and more. For $140 a year, you get all of that, plus no ads at all. Without our members, there is no podcast, not to mention that I'm out of a job. Thank you so much for listening and supporting us. We couldn't do it without you.
Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall podcast featuring Kate Riga. We are back again. We are in the what is it? We're back. This is the second, or I guess third episode in the Kamala era, for lack of a better word. And we did the first pod we did was, I guess, 2 days after the beginning of her campaign. Kate was away, so we had a week off. We had our pod last week. We're coming up on a month into the campaign, and and this is going to be a theme through this episode. It's sort of too much winning. It's like Trump said, there's too much winning. And in a way it is I don't know if I can handle this much winning, right? You kind of each day you look at the polls and they either creep up a little further for Kamala, or at least there's no regression in the polls, not using it in the technical polling nerd sense of the word. But a theme, I think, of this episode will be that for a lot of the elite national press, it is a little too much winning. They've had enough of the winning. And we have seen this sort of rising tide of at least sort of militant grumbliness, I guess I would say. Where is Kamala's policy papers? And where are Kamala's set piece press conferences? And why is she not sitting down for an interview with Lester Holt or George Stephanopoulos or whoever does the evening news on the networks, who I don't even know because no one watches that stuff anymore. But people they're getting grumbly. And so we're gonna talk about that. We're gonna talk about there's a lot of weird stuff going on. You have Trump and Elon talking for, I don't know, a couple hours, a couple nights ago, on Twitter, kind of like, I don't know. I listened to a bit of it. It sounded a bit like if you mic'd up the sort of the sad sacks at the end of the bar at the local, the neighborhood bar, and they're just talking and sort of, grumbling back and forth at each other. We also have this thing of the hacking of the Trump campaign, which probably is by Iranian state actors. The Trump campaign says it is. Microsoft, which I guess is sort of, kind of the equivalent of what CrowdStrike was in 2016, kind of an outside tech overseer player who has enough knowledge that is in a position to have some input on these things, says they saw some Iranian state actors trying to hack someone in the Trump campaign. That's going on there, and we have this weird thing where suddenly it's totally unacceptable to use hack materials for news organizations. And that actually is the right approach. But didn't used to be the right approach, apparently. And our former colleague, Brian Beutler, had a thing he published where he said, there's two acceptable outcomes here. One is to all the news organizations that were sent this material, and I guess it's at least Politico, but I think the Post and the Times also have the stuff. they should go to town and just kind of dig into it, or have some sort of final mea culpa. Like, we really screwed up in 2016, taking what we knew were the products of a Russian state enterprise and just making that the subject of the whole campaign. Uh, so a lot to talk about. We're also going to get into so latest polling, kind of preview of the convention. We're going to get into this, but I want to just make a note for you. Our team is going to be, uh, mainlining caffeine and going just wall to wall next week with the convention. Bringing you all of it, all the stuff in ways that we do, not your standard kind of just kind of focusing on the frivolities of it, but covering it in the way that I think only TPM can. So we're going to talk about that, but I want you to tune in, because we are really going to bring it next week on what's going to be a pretty significant pivot point in the campaign. Before we launch into everything, I want to remind you, we are now in the final lap of our annual TPM Journalism Fund drive, and as was the case last year, our members and our readers have really delivered. We started with a really critical goal that we needed to raise $500,000 in this year's drive, and last night we hit $400,000. So we are now in the final push. So if you have not contributed this year, especially if maybe you mainly just listen to the podcast, you don't visit the site a lot, TPM is what makes the podcast possible. So if you have been considering it, now's the time. It's really easy to contribute. Any amount is great. You can just go to the site. Again, if you're not a regular visitor, it's talkingpointsmemo.com. You just go to the main page, and you'll see little graphics and advertisements for the drive up. It's super simple to toss a few bucks into the mix. We hope you do, and we really thank I think almost 4,000 members, readers have contributed so far, and we really appreciate it. We in some ways we become used to you guys coming through for us, but I was trying to remind myself this morning, how big a deal that is, and how amazing that is. So amazing, and thank you. And if you haven't had a chance yet, please come on board. And yeah, I'm gonna bring in my co-host Kate. Is there too much winning?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Look, and this is a dynamic that we talk about all the time on the pod, right? Like, a huge part of elections is the fact that the reporters can only do so much with a stationary target, right? You can only write so many articles about, Kamala's rise and the Harris vibe campaign. And then Waltz kind of was a new part of that, right? But if you're trying to find people on both sides, you can't just kind of write positive stories about one candidate for too long. And pretty soon, the kind of natural, well, they're artificial, but the asymmetry in our campaign coverage ecosystem spring into place. And so that's manifesting as, well, Harris in her 3-week campaign has not outlined a policy platform, right? Um, Now, of course, you can counter, okay, so after 3 weeks, she's expected to have white papers. They would never ask such a thing of Trump, right? Like, it's baked in that he doesn't really have policy positions, or so far as he does, he's going to outsource everything to the Project 2025 guys and his kind of anti-abortion coalition. And, you know, if there's a vibes candidate, obviously Trump is a vibes candidate. And the extent of his policy is kind of like, you can shoot immigrants on site, and I'll give kind of a tax cut to bajillionaires if you support my campaign, kind of thing. Um, that's kind of going hand in hand with this demand that really the Trump campaign pushed on, and then reporters kind of took up the call, which is she needs to do more interviews, she needs to do kind of less orchestrated events, she needs to kind of sit down, like you said, with the big kind of like TV dudes, and give a long interview. And that, of course, is also kind of coming with the momentum of the whole Biden thing, this idea that he was hidden from reporters, and that's why this debate was kind of so catastrophic, because he'd been shielded from similar type environments. So, and my thoughts on that are, like I say, of course it's unfair, it's unbalanced. She's going to be things are going to be expected of her that would never be expected of Trump. But it's reporters' jobs to clamor for more interviews. That's what they're supposed to do.
Absolutely,
That's what we
absolutely,
want them to
absolutely.
do. She wants to be president. She should be able to hold, rigorous interviews with actual serious reporters, just like we would want our presidential candidate to be able to perform ably in a debate. And I think the campaign, most importantly, is cognizant of the biggest threat here, which is things are going well, right? You don't want to change things when it's working. But the threat there is that then you turn this interview into a huge fucking deal, right? That when she finally does it, it's wall to wall coverage. If she messes up, which she is human, she will at some point, it becomes a gigantic thing. And I think they're being pretty smart about it, because we've seen her, she's been walking up to the traveling press corps a lot outside her plane and taking questions from them there, which is going to soften the ground for this. I assume that when she does plan an interview, they'll spread it out a little bit. It won't just be like the one interview with George Stephanopoulos that'll make or break her candidacy. It'll be she'll do that, and maybe she'll do like a friendly podcast, and maybe a local TV outlet or something, kind of like spread it out so there's not a huge amount of import on one of these. And then as for the policy thing, she already told reporters that she also said that they are going to plan a sit down interview by the end of the month. And then she also said that they're planning to do some policy unveiling. And I think there's an event next week in North Carolina where that's going to kind of get kicked off. And I think the advantage she has on the policy front is, to some extent, it's so stupid, this demand for like granular policy plans, because it all depends on the composition of Congress, and everybody knows that, right? Like, you can have all the dreams in the world, and if one of the chambers or both of the chambers stays with Republicans or goes Republican, even if she wins, guess what? You're going to be passing appropriations bills and maybe like one or two kind of bipartisan, maybe infrastructure-y things, and that's the extent of it. But she is in this position now because her campaign is so new, because she's kind of already working off the Biden administration like viewpoint, and because the election is so soon, that she doesn't have to get into the granular details, like the actual difficult stuff, which is where the fighting comes from, right? Like the how do we pay for this and when does it sunset kind of stuff. Like, also, this is part of the advantage of running with Tim Walz, who passed, yeah, progressive, but super popular stuff, that she can just kind of stay in that space of, we want to do tax relief for families. We want to do free lunches. We want to do paid leave, right? Like this very kind of populisty. I assume there'll be a great focus on like affordability, right? Like, because that's such a huge concern for voters in housing, maybe debt stuff, maybe medical stuff. Like, she can kind of hit these super popular policies without actually having to get into the nitty gritty hard stuff. And by that point, any reporters that you hear being like, well, she's not giving us enough detail, it's like, okay, she's told you where she stands. You have an idea. Anyone demanding more than that is being like a little bit unrealistic and a little bit just kind of looking for stuff to ding her on, when we have absolutely no idea what the legislative reality will be in the next few months. So kind of that's where she is. And I think she is doing a good job not getting defensive about these demands, like I said, peppering in the interviews, doing the whole like, yeah, we're planning a sit down. Yeah, we're going to do a policy rollout. And to some degree, I think the policy thing is important because there is still a large swath of the kind of movable voters who say, well, we just don't know anything about her. And these are not the type of people who are going to know a whole lot about the Biden administration's position on stuff.
Mhm.
So I think there's upside to her as well.
Yeah, I mean, I have a few different thoughts about this, and one is that it is it's the job of reporters to want information to write stories about. That they want interviews, they want to see policy details, all that kind of stuff. That's their job. What I think is important to balance that with is that the job of the candidate is to win the election. The candidate is not trying to do civic education. The candidate is trying to win the election. That is their job. And the way these two things work together is that these two, um, maybe not antagonistic, but definitely counterpointed groups find areas where their interests align. Sometimes, you often will a candidate will do an interview because they want to get a message out, or maybe they're behind and they want to they want to break into the news cycle, and this is just the natural. This is the natural state of things. And again, so do I, and at a certain level, it's the job of journalists to be annoying. They're not they shouldn't be trying to be popular. They want more information. But again, I just think uh it's really important to understand what everybody's interests are. And in our current world where a lot gets piled onto Democratic candidates. Well, aren't you for a free press? If you're for a free press, why aren't you sitting down for, sort of like the guy, why aren't you going on a date with me? Give me a reason why you're not going on a date with me, kind of thing, right? You know, why aren't you? I'll do the interview when I want. I'm totally for the free press. Doesn't mean I'm going to do everything you want me to do. That doesn't make sense. The other thing, though, is for forever, I have always thought Democrats are really captured by policy literalism. It has always been a dynamic of Democratic campaigns where, especially when they don't go well, but sort of, throughout, of, wow, I have all these policy papers. And when we sit down with voters and explain them to the voters, they like them. So how is it we didn't win? Well, that's not what campaigns are about. It's totally not what campaigns are about. Campaigns are about conversations about values and directional signals about policy. And Harris is very clear directionally about where she is going in policy terms. So to the extent there is any truth in this, that and again, mainly what's going on here is you can't stand up a major presidential campaign on a dime, especially in a case, it's not just like here, like it only launched 3 weeks ago. There was absolutely no way she could even discuss this possibility with her closest advisors until 3 weeks ago. And she didn't. I'm sure with maybe one or two people, hey, let's just have our brains moving in case something happens. But seriously, no way you're doing anything until Biden makes that call. Most of it's that. But to the extent that there's a little less of that policy literalism, that's great as far as I'm concerned. Because again, that's not what campaigns are about. And in the same way that, like, if you're saying you're gonna, protect abortion rights, well, how are you gonna do that? Since, Republicans may control the Senate, they're certainly gonna have a filibuster. So, how are you gonna protect abortion? That's what the press should be asking. But again, so I kind of see a lot of this as a good thing. And just at a basic level, I mean, we are so far beyond what anybody could have hoped for with this switch. I mean, it defies all comprehension, really. I mean, we're basically, what is it? It's August 14th today. Biden dropped out, I believe, on July 21st. So we're a week or so out from a month into this. She keeps rising in the polls. How absurd! I mean, what she's doing is clearly working. The idea that she would like shift gears and do a big round of like of sit down interviews is absurd. And one thing you make a point of, one of the things that uh, the national press often gets really upset about is that presidential candidates generally want to talk to the local reporters. And there's a good reason that both sides want to do this. The national reporters, generally speaking, have one thing: they have more heft. They're not intimidated by talking to a presidential candidate. They see them every day. They also, uh, at least in theory, they have more in-depth knowledge, so they can push harder. Um, Sitting down with the reporter in Wisconsin, though, that has a lot more juice for the campaign. And so, in any case, I hope it does sit downs with local reporters. There's also that thing that the Times had with Biden. Not just why aren't you doing? You need to do it with us. You owe the country to do it with the New York Times. Well, that's bullshit. There's plenty of reporters who are up to the challenge of doing a good interview with a presidential candidate. So again, all of this stuff, there has definitely been, a week in, the Times published a piece that basically said, all right, honeymoon's coming to an end. Let's go on to the next thing. And that sort of, put out the theme that we've been in since about the first week of like, okay, enough of the momentum, enough of the vibes. Let's get back to the real stuff.
And I do want to prepare listeners for something I think might happen, which is, I mean, she has been in controlled environments so far, right? I mean, it's only been 3 weeks, but she's mostly just been giving her stump speech. Very low risk and very high reward. When she is in the less controlled atmospheres, both interview and debate, she's going to stumble, right? She's going to make a mistake. She's going to give a bad answer at some point. And I think that there is a real chance that, we're talking the kind of like the big national outlets will make a ton of hay over it if it's the right kind of mistake. And while a lot of what we've been talking about, I think, is very kind of legitimate journalistic kind of complaints and asks, this will come from the bucket of the less legitimate stuff. The idea that for certain reporters, they feel that they are not doing their job if they are not equally hard on Trump and the Democratic candidate. So that's something that might happen.
Can I say one thing on that?
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is what you mean, but I think it's worth expanding on it. It's not just being equally hard; it's having equally big blowups. Because I think they are equally hard. If anything, they're at least equally hard. But it's if you say, wow, Trump gave a press conference and he told 179 lies, and he said he would break 25 laws, that sets you up. You better hit Kamala pretty hard to have a sense of equaling that out.
Right. I mean, imagine if it was Harris who was saying his crowds are AI, right? Those people weren't real. I mean, it'd be wall-to-wall coverage of how one of the major candidates has lost her goddamn mind, right? But for Trump, it's a blip. It's baked in. It's expected. It's not even a headline story. So yeah, exactly. But I just think that's something to prepare for, because just like talking to some of my friends here, even who are like politically plugged in, there's just this idea of like this fucking rocks and this is going to rock for the next few months and the election is going to be a landslide and this is going to be the happiest Democrats have ever been. And I think to some degree that is that people my age don't have like the most clear and comprehensive memories of Obama, right? Like a lot of what stays with you is kind of the ecstatic 2008 night of the election being called and the giant party in Grant Park and all that kind of stuff. But it's not going to be like this forever. And I don't mean to say that people shouldn't be enjoying the moment. I just mean that when there she hits a bump, when the media kind of blows something out of proportion, don't freak out. That's part of campaigns. Like a part something that's not a part of a campaign is just happy go lucky for 3 months for a campaign that's doing everything right, that's not doing anything wrong, that goes in and then wins by a billion points. Like that's just not realistic. So I just think it's something to be prepared for and something to like not as much as you've been kind of probably enjoying the last few weeks, don't let yourself doom spiral
Yeah.
when she hits a pothole.
Yeah, you absolutely have to be prepared in campaigns as in life to roll with the punches. Not everything is not always going to be perfect, and it is, it's also the other side of that is that give yourself time to enjoy this run of momentum and good luck. Let it be a sponge for it and absorb all of it, but just with but save up some of that psychic power,
Right.
some of that for resilience later on, because there will be bumps. Just another way to look at it is that if you take the polls where they are right now, and take them, assume they are literally exactly how the election will turn out as they are right now. She's just at the point where you would say she is set up to win, right? There's a some people say, well, we know from the past elections the Democrat needs 4 percentage points in the popular vote to win. Well, it's actually not that clear. Just in too long to explain ways about the different mix of swing states and stuff like that. It could possibly be as low as 1 percentage point. It's probably closer to 2 percentage points than it was in the past. But I guess the point is that she's like, if we just say stop everything right here and just plug those poll numbers into the ballot boxes, she's only just winning. She's not landsliding by any stretch of the imagination. But each day the polls get a little better. So all of those things are right. And but it's also true. You soak it up and kind of thump your chest a bit, because that's the right thing to do as well.
Totally. Just don't get yourself into a place where when bad things happen, you freak out. I mean,
Fall
it's baked
apart.
in,
Yeah.
it's going to happen, right? Now I want to talk a little bit about what you mentioned, which was this bizarro hack of the Trump campaign, which seems to have come from the Iranians. And we learned about it in the first place because of the Trump campaign went public with it, which I think exacerbated the weirdness because then we learned that Politico, the Times, and the Post had all had these documents since late July, and we kind of found this out a few days ago, so a bit into
And
August.
let me ask you, what now, late July, was it pre Biden dropout? Probably not.
Politico
I guess
had
maybe
them
just after.
on the 22nd. That's what I
Okay,
remember
so
off the
like
top.
this. Okay, so just after. So I mean, it's all kind of hypotheticals and counterfactuals. But it would have been interesting if maybe like in the darkest of dark moments, if Politico was sitting on this
Right.
sitting on this stuff. So yeah.
And then it triggered recriminations from people who were like, okay, Politico, you had a live blog of you know, John Podesta's risotto recipe from the WikiLeaks going right up until election day, but now you're kind of showing restraint. And I understand where that feeling is coming from, but as you said in the intro, Josh, you don't want news outlets to just blithely launder material, particularly that was hacked by countries that we know are, you know, adverse to American democracy. Like that's how it should be. And
Hmm.
I agree with the Brian Beutler take that if these outlets have learned that lesson and are being a lot more scrupulous with this kind of, trove dumping, that they should also be completely transparent with the fact that they did fuck up in 2016 and that they learned from that and they're not going to do that again. And I think the lack of such a mea culpa does kind of speak to, how the New York Times got rid of their ombudsman and this lack of a priority on the kind of like public facing accountability to readership that I think has reflected in these outlets in other ways. Like I think the Times in particular has just it's been a slog of miserable headlines from them. I mean, including the one that really got a lot of traction about how Biden had left the country in a state of war. That was just like baffling.
Yeah.
But all that being said, I think we also have had inclinations that these outlets have learned those lessons prior to this, which I think you see most clearly in the treatment of the Hunter Biden laptop stuff.
Hmm.
Like that
Hmm.
was aggressively peddled to these same outlets by a whole host of kind of nefarious actors. And I thought by and large, they acted incredibly responsibly with with that material, and were really, really wary of where it was coming from and the kind of uh intent behind giving them these documents. And that was not necessarily without any cost to themselves, right? Like Hunter Biden is someone who's had a messy life. Like I'm sure there's a lot of salacious stuff in there. You had House Republicans ready, willing, and eager to give any media coverage like a giant amplification through the media ecosystem, of course, but also through a series of hearings as they tried to kind of make this into a giant scandal. So we have signs that they have learned and that they are training a more apprising eye on this kind of thing. And I don't think it's beyond the realm of possibility, knowing that a great deal of this trove was VP vetting materials, including for JD Vance. I think this also their decision to not publish it, and various of the outlets have said the newsworthiness did not outweigh the nerves of kind of publishing something
Yep.
sourced by Iranians. But I think it kind of speaks to the strength of the organic slash traditional opposition research response to JD Vance's candidacy, that so much was unearthed and brought to light, that when news outlets who primarily, right, they want eyes on their material, they want to break news first, that when they saw this trove, they were like, it's not that new, it's not that interesting, kind of compared to what we have already seen.
Right, right. Yeah, I have a few different thoughts on this sort of on this meta question about hacks and all that, all that kind of stuff. I agree with you. I think that by and large, the mainstream press reacted correctly on the Hunter Biden laptop stuff in those last couple weeks of the 2020 election. The part that I focus on is that for a major part of the political class, the political conversation, the Hunter Biden laptop became the holy grail or the Rosetta Stone of you know, uh, mainstream media interference in the election and covering up for Biden and all this kind of stuff, when in fact they did exactly what you would want them to do. And it is sort of treated now as, well, it turned out it wasn't hacked. It was really just his laptop. Well, that's not that's not clear at all. First of all, it is not at all clear to me, and I think people who actually look at this seriously, that it's really true that Hunter Biden just left his laptop at this place and it happened to be sort of like this wacko Trump dude who had Rudolph Giuliani on speed dial. The point and the whole idea that, like, well, it's real. All the stuff was real. The WikiLeaks stuff was real. This stuff is real. That's the point. It's always real. it can have non-real stuff, um, kind of woven into it. But that was it. This is a reminder that all of this stuff about, oh, the press showed their colors, they, put their finger on the scale, all this kind of stuff, they did what they should have done by and large. And I do think I mean, look, I would be shocked if they started doing something with this material, because they shouldn't do something with this material for all the reasons we said. Um, I think, in their defense, 2016, we hadn't had that happen before, and it was legitimately a new thing. That doesn't justify what happened, but this was not something that was dealt with in journalism school, right? How, what the equities, that were involved in this. Um, but with with all of these things, you still have, you still have a lot of double standards. And the point you made about that, I think, covers all of this stuff. It is conceivable that you would get into a situation, if the information was of sufficient gravity, that it would be a complicated journalistic question what to do. With the WikiLeaks stuff, that was just people's emails. And some people made some sort of like snotty remarks or whatever, but very vanilla for what you'd expect to find getting full access to an organization's emails. With Hunter Biden, overwhelmingly, it was just that he was a coke addict and like sleeping with tons of women and having lots of compromising photos and stuff like that, all of which is meaningless from any serious journalistic perspective. And there's some business stuff, but not much there that really amounted to anything. And in this stuff, I'm sure there's embarrassing stuff about the Trump campaign in there. And if that stuff were leaked by legitimate, means, go for it. Um, but but there's not. This is just embarrassing stuff, and this is the right way to deal with it. It just is.
I would also say that if the people who did the hack, if they want this stuff out badly enough, they'll either A, kind of keep going down the totem pole until they find someone who will publish it, or
Yep.
B, they'll
Yep.
just publish it online themselves, right? So
Yeah. Yeah. Which is
so
simple to do.
right, exactly. So that's where we are on that. Speaking of Trump, we want to get into kind of his latest belly flops, which Josh, you mentioned in the intro, this like bizarro uh X, Twitter Spaces interview that he did with Elon Musk, which had this just kind of like sad layer to it, because you have Trump coming back to Twitter for the first time, which used to be his kind of safe space, like the place that he both loved and from which he had, he was the assignment editor for most of American news for a time, which he was summarily kicked off of, because of January 6th and his kind of greatest moment of despair, when we thought that he might be kind of turned away from American politics for good. Elon Musk buys Twitter, says Trump's my main man. He is reinstated the moment the ink dries. Trump, in his classic kind of petulant way, is like, well, no, I'm on Truth Social now. That's where I'm going to do the goods. And that's where he's been, kind of a little bit out of sight, out of mind, because he can go on these like big, rambly, scary conspiracy speeches, and not that many people see them. So you have things dire enough for Trump that he's like, okay, fine, I'm going to come back and I'm going to do this interview and I'm going to be on Twitter again because things are not looking that good for me. So I got to break glass right now and try to kind of, slow the bleeding. And then for Elon Musk, you've got all the disasters of his kind of takeover of Twitter, and that it's losing money and losing users and this kind of constant threat that It's already not the public square it once was, and you've got competitors trying to kind of step in while it's weak. So he also needs Trump, right? He needs this big, high traffic interview, which I saw afterwards. He was saying that it got about 1 billion people interacted with it, which it's so funny if you're just going to kind of pull numbers out of your ass that instead of going with anything that like might be a little plausible. He's like 1 billion. It's like, okay, good job, Elon. And then so you've already got this kind of like sad two guys who kind of need each other type deal. And then it's beset with technological issues, for 40 minutes, like nobody can get in. You have like Bill Ackman tweeting, like, tell Elon we're not able to get in right now. So that's embarrassing, and which is kind of schadenfreudy because Elon, summarily fired all these workers at Twitter who presumably would have kind of made this run a little better. And then you finally get in the room, and it's this dynamic we see sometimes on Fox News too, where you've got a friendly to Trump interviewer who's trying to give him softballs. He's trying to make him look good. He's trying to maybe like rein him in when he gets a little wild, but Trump just can't be controlled that way. So it's the same kind of grievancy, angry, tangentially boring, um, weird lispy conversation that is awkward, that ends with neither of them knowing how to end the call, that's shoot from the hip. And this is also happening amid the backdrop of like the Harris campaign kind of rolling out with these like gigantic Zoom calls they've been doing, of like the white women for Harris, black men for Harris, whatever, that have like a gajillion people on them, and that all seems to kind of like run fine. And maybe that's just a more a tribute to Zoom's interface, but God, for being this like really buzzy, exciting, uh big interview in a non-traditional media space, it went largely worse than the DeSantis X Spaces rollout, which the Trump campaign ridiculed mightily at the time.
Who also
So
kind of ended his campaign, or was a
right,
catalyst for ending his campaign.
right, yeah.
It's funny because he said there was a DDoS attack, which is a denial of service attack that
So
made it
funny.
full, which is such BS. I mean, on so many different levels. Because I know a little about this. I haven't been involved in this side of that side of what we do for a long time, and obviously TPM is orders and orders of magnitude smaller, but you still learn something about this kind of stuff. And at that scale, nothing like that should ever happen. I mean, have you heard of Facebook being taken offline by a DDoS attack, or Netflix or Amazon? Doesn't happen. You can have things happen, but at that scale, you have so many different tools to use to prevent that kind of stuff. What's obvious that happened here is that it's difficult for programmers and technologists and engineers in all cases to know what is going to happen when a service or an app or anything else that normally gets x usage, xy usage, gets 50x usage. It's hard to know. It's hard to, and there are ways you can test those things. Um, but that's if you have a lot of tech redundancy and people to work on stuff like that. What's clear is it is just not that well put together, and so it breaks when you get a lot more people. And the other thing is that, as we saw there, Elon is just kind of an awkward dude, and that's fine. A lot of people are awkward. That's totally fine. Um, Anybody who had, the thing is with, Laura Ingraham and maybe Hannity, those people know when to kind of try to help Trump, but Elon needs his own minder. He's out there like posting these like extreme like neo-Nazi memes and stuff. He's totally out of control himself, so he's not gonna keep Trump in line. I mean, what made sense to do here is you also don't go on for 2 hours. It's hard to fill space for 2 hours, especially, or if it's easy in bad ways. They should have had someone who knows how to run an interview, which not everybody knows how to do, um, and kind of do a joint interview with both of them and set some time limits. Um, yeah, no, and the funny thing, which is kind of related to this. I mean, I think everybody saw this press conference that Trump held. What was that, Monday? When was that? It's time means nothing nowadays. It was relatively recently. It was a bit of a train wreck. I mean, he's Trump is obvious is clearly, um he doesn't know how to run this campaign, and I think he lacks the fluidness and dexterity he had 8 years ago to kind of feel the room and move on a dime, right, and kind of come up with a new thing to maintain attention, and he's struggling with that. If you had sympathy for Trump, you would feel bad that they uh, spent 2 years planning for a campaign against one guy, did their convention, did everything, and now they're facing someone else. I mean, that sucks. That's tough to do. And just before we started this podcast, he announced he's doing another press conference at Bedminster tomorrow, and I suspect it will be the same thing.
Yeah, and I mean, even on top of his just kind of getting older and less sharp, he's out of practice. I mean, this is what happens when you kind of avoid not just hostile press, but all but the friendliest press for months and months and months, right? And when you're a guy like Trump who gets defensive and angry when you press him on stuff, it's just not a good look, you know? And also, I just wanted to say to your point of the Elon interview being 2 hours long, it brought me right back to when he was, when he was president, and he would like call in to Fox and Friends, and they would have to be like, "Okay, Mr. President, like we know you're busy. We're going to let you go." When the overwhelming impression is like, he'll do this as long as you'll have him. He will do this for 5 to 10 hours. He's got nowhere to be. He's got nothing to do, right? Which has always to me been such a funny and kind of truthful lens into how, Trump was as president and how he is campaigning. It's like he doesn't have a tight schedule. He's fine. He can go as long as you want.
And he also, even when it's going poorly, he clearly gets a lot of the attention is incredibly nourishing for him, and that is, there was, as we said earlier in this episode of the pod, it's the job of reporters to demand this and demand that. It's the job of the campaigns to do what is in their interest to do. That all makes sense. It's the job of the Trump campaign to say, "Oh, where's your policy? Oh, where's your interview? Oh," but they're looking for every opening. They're looking for every opening they can, and in one of these sort of fusillades from the Trump campaign, they said, "Well, he just did a hour and a half open ended press conference. He sort of drank everybody else under the table, until no one could even think of another question, and sort of more cognitive feats of strength, as it were, as we used to say with President Biden." And they listed off, like, how he called into this and called into that, and yes, and if you like that kind of Trump show, he does put on that Trump show, but clearly he digs that. He likes the attention. And the Harris campaign, they're trying to win the election. I don't think you have Kamala there like, "Get me in front of some people. I want to talk.
Right.
I want some love." Right? I mean, this is Trump's Trump's mental psychodrama, not like what they're willing to do as a campaign and all this
Right.
kind of stuff.
I mean, in the Spaces interview and the Bedminster press conference and the announcement of events he's actually going to start doing in swing states versus he said openly, "Oh, I'm not really gonna do anything until the Democratic convention." And I mean, we've seen it. He's done
After the Democratic
right. He's
convention.
done, like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
one event in Montana and, like, nothing else on his schedule. He's just not really been actively campaigning in any sense of the word, and he could get away with that when he was running against Biden, who did, granted, is president and actually takes the job seriously, unlike Trump, so has a crowded schedule, but we know at this point, which is not physically able to do the grueling, really tough campaigning that includes, you have your daily security briefing and then you go and do a breakfast with local faith leaders and then you have a call with a foreign leader and then you have to bounce to do a rally that evening and there's a 24-hour turnaround to get in a new state. Like, it's tough, right? And Biden just he wasn't carrying that full of a schedule. But now Harris absolutely is. I mean, she's doing blockbuster rallies almost
Constant,
every
constant. Yep,
day.
yep.
Um Peppered with she is doing interviews. She's not doing the kind that the press wants, but she is, she's gone on podcasts and stuff and lots of travel. They're moving really fast, right? They're going to a lot of states. And so what kind of allowed him to kick back before doesn't look so good anymore. He has got to kind of get into the game. And I think that's reflected in this filling of his calendar with events and press conferences. I think he's realizing that he can't just really kind of kick back and hope that the honeymoon fizzles out. Like, he does have to actively get out there and counter program, especially because we're headed into the convention now, right? Which is like the biggest earned media bump a candidate gets. So he can't just kind of sit back and maybe call into Newsmax every once in a while. He's kind of got to get out there more, which for Trump has been for the worst, right? Because people are seeing that he's even more rambly than he used to be and he keeps bringing back up the Stop the Steal, and he goes on tirades against Brian Kemp, right? I mean, he's less disciplined than he's ever been, and now he's got no choice but to put himself out there a lot because he's losing ground.
Yeah, there's the point that I think is really key there is that as long as, and for months, and I was certainly part of this, we had this ongoing debate, is Biden behind or is it kind of tied, right? And but I think the reality is that as long as Trump was a bit ahead, not hugely ahead, but a bit ahead, right? And as long as it was very static, you may only be a bit ahead, but if you've been a bit ahead for months and months and months, that kind of builds up over time. And as long as that was the case, he can just go into the orange tanning bed and do whatever he wants. And if people say, "Oh, you should be doing this or should be doing that," I'm ahead. I don't have to do jack. Nothing matters. And that was, you know, that was really the key to all of this is that as long as he was a bit ahead and the polls were static, he didn't really have to do anything but stay in his comfort zone. And his comfort zone was every week or 10 days going to a friendly state or a friendly part of a swing state and doing a rally and doing that kind of monologue and getting that adoration and the call and response and whatever. And that really, I think, for us as viewers of the show, it hid for a lot of people that he wasn't the candidate he used to be, or even if you could see if he that he was not the candidate he used to be, it doesn't matter because it's clearly enough to beat Joe Biden. I'm not saying he was necessarily going to beat Joe Biden until everything kind of fell apart in July, but it, it he's winning, because remember, if you remember, early in the Republican primary process, the people who did not want to see Trump be the nominee again were saying, "Hey, he is a sure loser. Do not do this again. We don't need to do 2020 again. He's going to lose. Pick someone else." And at a certain point, that started to fall apart in the middle of 2023 because it gets really hard to say he's a sure loser when the polls say he's winning. How are you going to say he's a sure loser? The polls say he's beating Joe Biden. So how is that how is that a good argument? And I think what again that kept out of public view is that it is one thing what you have to deliver as a candidate when you're winning, but you need to bring something entirely different when you're behind. And he's clearly behind now. There's no question about that. That doesn't mean he's losing. Losing is a sort of a forward through time kind of statement. But he's behind. And when you're behind, you've got to shake things up and you've got to keep coming up with new stuff. And so far that has not worked. And Kate, you made this point earlier that people need to, and I 100% agree with this, people need to be prepared that at some point Harris's poll numbers will start going down and she'll have bad press cycles, and you need to be ready to work through that, even if you are not involved in a really direct and material sense, just for your own internal well-being. You need to be ready for that. But he's trying, and he cannot seem to get footing. And some of that is whatever the weird confluence of different things that has made this Harris thing possible. And I don't think we're going to know for a long time just how everything has come together. That's not, I want to be clear, that is not saying that she is sort of like an accidental recipient of some cosmic magic. She's running a really strong campaign, but people run really strong campaigns a lot and lose, right? There's some confluence there, and you just see it. He doesn't have, as evil as he may have been in 2016, he had an instinctive feel for how to grab onto press cycles. And your point, Kate, about um, when he used to be more ubiquitous, people forget he wasn't just calling into Fox. He's calling into CNN nonstop, calling in everywhere. And the interesting thing is, and again, I think this is really important to remember. Every day of the 2016 campaign, he was having the fucking time of his life. And you could feel it. He was loving it, loving it, loving it. Calling everywhere, calling CNN, calling MSNBC, calling everywhere. And starting when he became president, he was not loving it. He hasn't loved a single day since he became president. And those things matter. It's all kind of, those are all things you need to be able to kind of grab hold of a campaign cycle and bring it back to you and sort of, wrestle it without its consent is part of his mentality to do what you want. And he's not having luck with that now.
And it's really clear that the debate evolution is part of this whole thing, right? The same reason that he has to do these press conferences and he has to get out on the trail more, same reason that initial stance of I'm not going to debate Harris unless we do it at Fox with my campaign manager as the question asker in front of everyone who has voted for me twice, like that had to go out the window, right? And then he had to do okay, fine, I'm going to do the ABC debate, and I'll do a lot with her. I'll do as many as she wants, right? It's like that,
On her terms.
right? That is the post Trump slipping position. If we remember, after the debate against Biden, which could not have conceivably gone any better for Trump, he was doing the whole, I'm not going to put him through that again. I mean, and why would you? Like, that debate went perfectly for him. His work was done. There's nothing for him to gain by debating again because it couldn't have gone better. It could only go worse for him. So the fact that, and then he kind of went into this being like, well, maybe I don't have to debate her. And then, oh, fuck, I do have to debate her, right? I have no choice. That's all coming from the same posture. Like, when you're coming from behind, you don't get to skip stuff you don't want to do, right? You have to play ball, even if there's inherent risk, right? Even if changing the narrative comes with doing events that you might mess up that aren't scripted, right? So that's part and parcel with this too,
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and still not clear to me that he will actually show up for that debate, but I think he probably
as
will because he
always,
has
right?
to.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, he'll. I'm sure he will do. I'm sure he will do some late before the debate, and that's the 10th. So it's 3 weeks away. Give a little more than 3 weeks, a little less than a month away. I'm sure he'll do some last minute. Oh, I won't show up unless you do this, or all the all the kind of the gamesmanship to kind of gain attention that Trump does. But I think he will. It will not work because I'm certain that Harris will just say, "Yeah, you'll be there. I'll be there. If you want to if you're not up to it, like whatever. I don't care." And I think she doesn't care because at this point, I think she would happily go with the headlines of Trump chickened out again. And she's winning. She doesn't need the debate and she knows it. So and that is an especially bad position to be in for a candidate whose whole program is strength and dominance. What Biden was hoping for in this, and if July had never happened, if that debate had never happened, who knows whether it would have been possible. But Biden's theory was basically like, yeah, I'm not the most dynamic. I'm not the physically the man I used to be, but I'm not insane and I know how to run the country. And so vote on that basis. Trump can't say that because he is insane and he doesn't know how to run the country. If he's not dominant, he's kind of not anything. And so that's rough. Should we talk about the convention and the polls?
Yep. So headed into the convention, they've released kind of a skeleton schedule. It's much what you'd expect, right? The Clintons are speaking, Obama's speaking, Biden's going to speak. Um, it'll be a good feelings. Thank you, Joe. Let's go, Kamala type deal. Buoyed by the fact that, as you said earlier, the polls are just kind of getting better and better for her. I took a look at the 538 aggregate before we got on, and it's much how you would expect given the degree by which Biden was, trailing in some of these places, right? She's pulled basically level in like what we call the quote unquote kind of Sun Belt, the Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, like those are all basically within 2 points, kind of margin of error type stuff. She's pulled ahead in what we call the quote unquote blue wall states, the Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Interestingly, in recent polls, we're seeing kind of North Carolina crop up as she's getting within spitting distance there. One I just saw this morning, I think, had her tied. So pretty gigantic deal there.
And that is you know, Arizona, Georgia, even Nevada are kind of death blows for Trump if he loses them. But North Carolina is
Game over.
total game over. There was actually a poll out today that had I don't want to say the number because I'm forgetting the number. Had her close in Florida. Now, let me be clear. She is not going to win Florida, but it is a measure of when states like that get kind of close. That shows you where the because even though all of these states have different demographies and different histories and different kind of micro political cultures, the country definitely generally moves together, right? You're kind of moving 4 points in Michigan, you're going to probably move around that in Texas. Just doesn't matter as much in Texas because it's a different starts in a different place. The two things though that are interesting about those coastal Atlantic states that are generally Republican. One is Rick Scott seems to be in a closer race than he thought he was going to be. And while I'm quite confident that Trump will end up winning Florida, that doesn't mean that Rick Scott will survive that election if it's closer than we think. So there are certain things that are kind of coming into, and that's good because we're getting some not great news out of John Tester's race in Montana, which is really unfortunate because we, at a certain level, we see like it's just a numbers game. You want more senators, not less, but not all senators the same. John Tester's a good guy. It would be really sad to see him lose his race. That's one thing about Florida, and there's just some hints about that. I think in that in that in that poll that had Harris, closer than you would think in Florida. I don't think they had a horse race for the Senate, but I believe they showed Scott's approval rating, and it was not good at all. So that's one thing. The other thing about North Carolina is they've got this, I think his name's Mark Robinson, his last name's Robinson, this guy who's the top of the ticket running for governor, who is just a complete nut. Crazy, crazy, crazy. It seems pretty clear he's going to lose badly to the Democrat, who I believe his name is Josh Stein. But in any case, if she is in shooting distance in North Carolina, having someone that radioactive at the top of the ticket, creates a dynamic where maybe it's possible. And the weird thing about North Carolina is, for a while, people saw that as more of a reach than Florida. But in fact, in the last couple of elections, it's been super close. It's like a 1 point or 2 point race, even though it is treated in most cases rightly as not really, it's not really in contention. So it's not like you need some like, category 5 Kamala hurricane or something like that. It's close every time. It just keeps Obama won it once, then Republicans, I believe, won it in 12, 16, and 20. So these things are, these things are possible.
And not to bring it into a dark place, but she doesn't need to win all of these to win, right? I mean, if she takes the blue wall plus the Nebraska district, I mean, that's ball game. That you win the White House. But there is just no doubt that Trump is not going to go quietly into this good night. He is going to fight these results as hard as he can. We can trust that his team has probably learned some lessons from the last time, so they'll try to fight the results more efficiently, to seek out friendlier judges. Um, as we've been saying, for Trump, this is not about will you be president or not. It's will you be president or will you go to jail? It's existential for him. If there's any way for him to overturn the results if she wins, he's going to try to do it. There's no question. And I think what saved us in 2020 was the courage of some Republicans in these positions who didn't, kind of bow to his pressure, but also, even though the election was close, Biden won by enough states that you would have needed so many actors, even perhaps those who are inclined in Trump's direction, to do his bidding to overturn the results, that it just became impossible. Whereas I think the big fear is that if, say, she wins, but it's a toss up, right? She wins with 270 and not a dime more. That is going to concentrate so much pressure on such a smaller pool of people, coupled with the fact that some of these kind of MAGA types have infiltrated these jobs that they previously wouldn't have thought to infiltrate, like, your secretaries of state, or I saw that Stephen Richter, the old Maricopa County recorder, who's kind of been in locked battle with Carrie Lake for years. He just lost his race, right? Like,
Yep.
that old
Yep.
guard has been kind of pushed out. So from that perspective, North Carolina perhaps being at play, which would indicate that likelier or not, she wins the Sun Belt states as well. That's a big deal because the bigger buffer she amasses, the harder it's going to be for him to steal it.
It's a critical point, and that really was the the sort of the subtext or the reality hanging in the distance in all of that funny business that we saw in November, December into January 20 2020, 2021, that like, yeah, even if he got that Raffsperger guy to do something, like, okay, you still need like two more states, right? That just made that that had such an impact, not least of which because it took pressure off each player. It removed pressure off each individual player, because if you had that that Vos guy, who's the very powerful speaker of the state house, I believe, in Wisconsin, if it would have if people in Wisconsin and all the sort of the Trump crazies applying pressure nationwide would have said, dude, one act on your part and Trump is president, and you are not going to do, concentrating that pressure. But it was never that kind of like, yeah, you do it, then Trump's got three other dudes he has to, so it was always just like in many, that's why they did the fake electors thing. That's why they eventually resorted to violence, because there was just no way to find one like stool pigeon who would do the deed. So it's not where we want to be, and there's some important structural differences, in as much as that Joe Biden controls the executive branch. Kamala Harris will be the Mike Pence. She's not going to want to show courage, as they said, and stop her own election. But there's all sorts of weak points. There just are, and so you really do want to kind of run up a margin. And God, I think that's basically if you get all the blue wall states, you lose all the southern states, you lose Nevada. That you're at 270, man. 270. That is just
That's so
that's not
close.
pretty.
It's
That's
so
not
close.
pretty,
Yep.
and not close. It's so close these days is not. In the old days, it would have been just a kind of a, you get goosebumps. Oh, it's so close. But we know so close in this reality means maybe it won't happen,
And we
because
know it
there's so many points of potential funny business.
exactly. And we know that such an election would not be called for days, right? And Trump has so successfully kind of used those delays. Well, not successfully, it didn't work, but he has used those delays to backfill his arguments, right? Like, well, the fact that you don't know right now, that's nefarious enough. You always used to know right away who won the election, right? Even though that's not true either. But you know, it's just I'm not saying that if it was that close that he would be able to steal it, because by the same token that Trump's people have learned from last time, the opposing side has learned from last time, right? I mean, and like you say, Democrats have the White House. In some of these key states, the governors are Democrats. Like I don't want everyone to just kind of panic or feel like it doesn't matter what happens, but we know he'll try. We know he's going to fight for it. So the fact that she is polling competitively in North Carolina, the fact that she's polling competitively in Florida. I mean, that's the Democratic equivalent for when we were hearing those scary things from the last days of Biden's
New
candidacy,
Jersey
that
and Minnesota.
Virginia
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
New Mexico, right? So, I mean, it's a good place to be. And, if she can kind of continue on this trajectory, it's good in the old fashioned political sense of making him have to spend money and compete in places like North Carolina and Florida that 3 weeks ago he thought were automatic wins. And it's good in the new, scary, creeping, you know, fascist attempted takeover state of things, which is that would just indicate that those other easier states are more likely to fall in her bucket, which just makes the whole thing a lot more comfortable for all of us.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. Uh, okay. I think that about covers it. We
Yep.
covered a lot of ground. That point that Kate made, um, that is really what I would suggest to anyone. Um, if not, if you have a role in this campaign, just you have an investment of your own in your own mental well-being, and really as a as a country, as a sort of a political coalition, if you see yourself as part of the sort of the broader democratic political coalition, even if you are not even if you are not out there actively volunteering, let alone like working for the campaign or something like that, your own mental equilibrium and your enthusiasm, and being able to not get demoralized in tough moments. None of us are an island in the political world. These things actually, your own resilience is a form of activism. It really is. It genuinely is. And so I think at least it is important to don't don't think you're jinxing anything by soaking up the positive news that is coming in right now. Completely soak it in, drench yourself in it. That is not going to jinx anything. Also have in your mind there are going to be tougher times. There may be very tough times, and bank some of this positive vibes to see you through those tough times. But again, your mental equilibrium, your mental political equilibrium is a form of activism. You being able to remain positive, hanging in there in the tough times, that is not just a matter of your own personal mental well-being, although that is enough because you don't want to bum yourself out, right? But those things really matter. So hang in there, soak up these really fun headlines, and we will be back next week. And I remind you, next week will be in the middle of the Democratic convention. The whole TPM team will be leaving nothing on the field to really, cover the hell out of that thing, bring you the story in all of its dimensions. So be sure to tune in for our coverage next week, and we will be back with you Wednesday. And remember the drive. We're in the final lap of our drive. If you haven't contributed, please consider contributing. And that is all we got for this week.
All right. See you next week.
Later.
The Josh Marshall podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe wherever you listen.